Justin, a major trade confrontation is drawing intense attention as tariffs imposed by Trump appear to be triggering serious consequences across North America. What was designed as a pressure move is now facing strong resistance, and Canada's response is being described by analysts as one of the most significant economic countermeasures in recent history. At the center of the discussion is a figure that keeps appearing in expert analysis, a response valued at up to $1.5 trillion. To understand what is happening, it is important to begin with the facts. Tariffs were introduced with the goal of reshaping trade relationships and protecting domestic industries. These measures targeted key imports, including metals, manufactured goods, and industrial components. The intention was to raise costs for foreign suppliers and encourage production to shift back across the border. However, trade data and official statements show that Canada did not respond with silence. Instead, Canadian policymakers moved quickly to assess the long-term risks. Rather than reacting with a single retaliatory tariff, they began restructuring trade priorities, investment strategies, and supply partnerships. This approach was not loud or dramatic, but it was broad and calculated. Canada announced plans to accelerate domestic production, expand trade ties with Europe and Asia, and reduce dependence on U.S.-linked supply chains. Major infrastructure investments were outlined, including transportation networks, energy projects, and industrial modernization. Analysts explain that when these initiatives are combined over time, their economic value reaches into the trillions. This is where the $1.5 trillion figure comes in. It does not represent a single check or one policy decision. Instead, it reflects long-term trade redirection, investment shifts, and supply chain restructuring. Canada's economy, deeply integrated with global markets, began adjusting its trajectory in ways that reduce vulnerability to future tariff shocks. From a factual standpoint, this shift has already produced measurable effects. Some U.S. exporters have reported declining orders. Certain industries that relied heavily on cross-border trade are experiencing delays, higher costs, and uncertainty. Transportation data shows reduced truck traffic on some routes, while shipping activity toward alternative markets has increased. Analysts warn that tariffs often create unintended consequences, especially when applied between closely connected economies. The U.S. and Canada share one of the most complex trade relationships in the world. Components often cross the border multiple times before a final product is completed. When tariffs disrupt this flow, costs rise not once, but repeatedly at each stage of production. This could mean that the burden does not fall neatly on one side. Businesses pass costs to suppliers, suppliers pass them to manufacturers, and manufacturers pass them to consumers. Over time, this ripple effect becomes difficult to control. What begins as a targeted policy can expand into a wider economic strain. Canada's response strategy appears designed to absorb short-term pain while building long-term insulation. By investing heavily in domestic capacity and diversifying trade partners, the country reduces exposure to future tariff pressure. Analysts note that this type of response is slower, but often more durable than direct retaliation. At the same time, the scale of the response signals something larger. It suggests a shift in how Canada views its economic security. Rather than assuming stable access to the U.S. market, policymakers are planning for uncertainty. This change in mindset could permanently reshape trade patterns across the region. For the U.S., this development raises difficult questions. Tariffs were meant to strengthen domestic industry, but some sectors are now facing shrinking export opportunities. Farmers, manufacturers, and logistics companies have all reported challenges linked to reduced Canadian demand. In some cases, alternative markets are not easily accessible. This could mean that domestic producers face higher costs without guaranteed gains. Analysts warn that when allies adjust their economies to reduce reliance, restoring previous trade volumes becomes much harder. Even if tariffs are later reduced or removed, supply chains that have shifted may not return. Another key factor is investor confidence. Markets react not only to policy, but to predictability. Ongoing trade friction introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty discourages long-term investment. Companies delay expansion, pause hiring, or redirect capital to more stable regions. Over time, this affects growth and competitiveness. Canada's long-term investment plans send a message to global markets that it is actively managing risk. Large-scale infrastructure spending and diversified trade agreements can attract foreign capital. Analysts note that this positioning could strengthen Canada's role as a global trade hub. Even as regional tensions persist, this could mean that the balance of economic influence in North America slowly shifts, not through confrontation, but through adaptation. Trade wars are often measured in headlines and tariffs, but their real impact unfolds quietly, over years, through decisions about where factories are built and which routes goods travel. The situation also highlights a broader lesson about interconnected economies. When two countries are deeply linked, actions aimed at pressure can quickly become mutual strain. Analysts warn that such dynamics make clean victories rare. Instead, both sides must manage losses while trying to secure long-term advantage. Public reaction reflects this complexity. Supporters of tariffs emphasize sovereignty and leverage, while critics point to rising prices and lost exports. What is increasingly clear is that Canada's response has changed the equation. The cost-benefit calculation no longer looks as straightforward as it once did. This could mean future trade decisions will be approached with greater caution. Policymakers may weigh not just immediate gains, but the risk of prompting large-scale structural shifts. Once supply chains adapt, reversing course becomes costly and uncertain. As this situation continues to evolve, attention is likely to remain focused on data rather than rhetoric. Trade volumes, investment flows, and employment figures will reveal whether the strategy delivers its intended outcomes. Analysts warn that the full effects may take years to become visible. For now, the story is less about a single policy and more about how nations respond to pressure. Canada's $1.5 trillion adjustment is not a single act of defiance, but a comprehensive rethinking of economic resilience. That response, in turn, forces a reassessment of the original strategy behind the tariffs. This could mean that the true impact of this trade confrontation will not be measured in speeches or negotiations, but in the slow redrawing of economic maps. As the situation continues to unfold, the long-term significance of this trade confrontation is becoming clearer. What began as a tariff-based strategy has expanded into a broader economic shift, one that reaches far beyond short-term price changes or political messaging. Analysts warn that when large, interconnected economies adjust their behavior, the effects can reshape markets for years. Canada's response, often described in financial terms reaching up to $1.5 trillion, reflects more than retaliation. It represents a deliberate effort to reduce exposure, strengthen internal capacity, and diversify economic relationships. This approach does not produce instant results, but it gradually changes how goods, capital, and investment move across borders. This could mean that some trade links once taken for granted may not fully return. Supply chains that shift to new routes tend to stay there, especially when significant investment follows. Once factories are built, ports expanded, and contracts signed elsewhere, reversing those decisions becomes costly and uncertain. Analysts caution that even if tariffs are relaxed in the future, the economic landscape may already look different. For businesses, this adjustment period brings difficult choices. Companies must decide whether to absorb higher costs, pass them on to consumers, or relocate parts of their operations. None of these options is simple. Over time, these decisions influence employment, wages, and competitiveness. Analysts warn that prolonged uncertainty can slow innovation and discourage expansion. Consumers also feel the impact, often quietly and gradually. Higher prices, fewer choices, or delayed deliveries may not dominate headlines, but they shape everyday life. This could mean that the real cost of trade conflict is spread across millions of small decisions rather than concentrated in one dramatic moment. And from a policy perspective, the situation underscores the limits of pressure-based trade tools. Tariffs can influence behavior, but they also invite adaptation. Canada's strategy shows how countries can respond by building alternatives rather than matching pressure step for step. Analysts note that this kind of response may be less visible, but it can be more enduring. The broader implication is a slow rebalancing of economic power, not through confrontation, but through diversification. As Canada strengthens ties with other markets and invests heavily at home, its economic profile evolves. This could mean increased resilience in the face of future disruptions, but also a more complex and competitive trade environment for the U.S. The challenge lies in adjusting to these changes. Industries that once relied heavily on Canadian demand may need to seek new markets or reconfigure operations. Analysts warn that rebuilding lost trust and predictability in trade relationships can take longer than imposing restrictions in the first place. This moment also raises questions about global trade norms. As more countries witness the effects of tariffs between close partners, they may reconsider their own strategies. This could mean a renewed emphasis on diversification, regional agreements, and domestic capacity building across the world. Ultimately, the story is not about who wins or loses in the short term. It is about how economies respond under pressure and how those responses reshape the future. Canada's large-scale adjustment highlights the power of long-term planning in a world where economic certainty is no longer guaranteed. As viewers reflect on these developments, the key issue becomes broader than any single policy. It is about how nations balance protection, cooperation, and resilience in an interconnected global system. So the question remains, when economic pressure leads to lasting structural change, are short-term trade tools worth the long-term transformations they set in motion?